Hey everyone, welcome back to another lecture. Last time we finished the third PowerPoint by discussing Thomas Jefferson's slave mistress Sally Hemings and sort of the background of that. And then we continued along that same thread by discussing miscegenation, which were anti-interracial marriage laws. As I mentioned, interracial marriage would be largely illegal until 1968. We also talked about the Creole people. They were mixed race. They were valued for being lighter skinned than other black people, but they were also slaves, right? They were still, at the end of the day, slaves, and they brought a lot of culture to mostly the South, especially New Orleans, right? We also talked about the preservation of African culture, how the African slaves preserved their culture, even though during the seizing process we covered that the masters often tried to get rid of that culture. And then we ended with the first practicing African American doctor in this country, James Durham, and sort of how he got to start practicing medicine, and he just mysteriously disappeared out of nowhere, which is crazy, right? So today we are going to start the fourth PowerPoint by talking about the American Revolution, something that all of you have probably learned a billion times in school, but we're going to discuss it mainly through the context of African Americans and how they not only fought in the war, but also what this country did for them in the beginning of the revolution, even before the revolution, right, and after the revolution. That's why our next PowerPoint will be about the Constitution and how Black people were written into the Constitution. Okay, so I like to start big topics like this with a general overview. I'll do the same thing with the Civil War. So the American Revolution started because of two things, right? Firstly, I mentioned we were in the 7 Years' War. It was the British colonists versus the French / their Native American allies. The British spent a lot of money because not only were they fighting here, but also in India and in Europe. So it was a huge, costly war. Not only did they superimpose all these taxes on us without representation, right? Taxation without representation, but also they got a bunch of land from the French, a little bit east to the 13 original colonies, and they prevented the American colonists from settling there. They said, no, they've learned their lesson from the war, they don't want to mess with the Native Americans necessarily, so they said that we couldn't settle on that land because it's Native American land, which, was the right thing to do, but we were super pissed off about it. So those two main reasons are why we eventually split from England. Now, things were kicking off pretty bad, right? The American colonists, of course, were very angry about these changes. So what the British Crown decided to do was to send more troops over to the United States in the thousands. And what that did was not only was an intimidation, but also because we were under the British Crown, we couldn't necessarily argue with the troops. So they were armed in a lot of cases in conflicts when we weren't allowed to be armed, or they were actually allowed to stay in our homes without, asking for permission. That's why we have the third amendment of the Constitution, right? That says that you don't have to quarter anybody in your home if you don't want to. It's exactly because of this. The man who started all of this was George III. We now know that he was mentally ill. He was part of the great European ruling class, the Habsburgs. They were a family that was spread out and ruled various countries in Europe, including England, and they also practiced incest, right? So George was partially a product of incest, and the problem with incest is that, which I sometimes give this lecture in person because it's kind of fun. The problem with incest is that you pass on traits, recessive traits. They're not necessarily the best, right? So mental illness was one of them, right? So George decided, he was the one who decided taxation without representation. He's like, I'm the king of England, you need to listen to me, even though you live in the colonies away from England, you need to do what I say. So, very totalitarian views of things, like a king does. So signs like this came out, right? People don't tread on me, taxation without representation, things like that. Sort of the rebellion started to brew, right? Because unlike the Spanish and the French and um, those empires whose colonists largely depended on the mainland, the American colonists didn't necessarily depend super much on England. Like they were pretty self-sustaining on their own, which led to our idea of independence, right? If we didn't need Britain, then it was easier for us to break up with them. We will discuss the Boston Massacre today because the first black man to die for America was the first to die in the Boston Massacre. We also had rebellions like the Boston Tea Party, right? Boston was one of the first places, and Massachusetts in general, to defy the British Crown, and they largely tried to get everybody else on board. So the Boston Tea Party, a bunch of Boston Patriots called the Sons of Liberty, disguised themselves as Native Americans and jumped on one of these ships in the Boston Harbor and dumped out all that tea, which was worth millions of dollars, and that tea was meant to last decades. So it was a huge blow to the British. Finally, we got together the greatest minds in the country, mostly lawyers and businessmen and big farmers, and they decided to formally break up with England, right? By writing the Declaration of Independence, which we'll talk about today, essentially saying that these are the crimes you did against us. We cannot take it anymore. We believe in liberty and freedom and justice, right? And that was, of course, written by our friend Thomas Jefferson, friend sarcastically. Of course, that kicked off the American Revolution. So the American Revolution, of course, lasted less than a decade. It was probably about like 6 years, about 5 or 6 years. This is General Washington, who we talked about before, in his famous secret mission in Delaware, where he and his men attacked British troops on Christmas Day when they were most vulnerable. So, of course, we won that war, and we became the United States of America. We formed our own constitution, and we became the first democracy in the world. We were a very experimental country, and we didn't feel totally solidified until after 1812 when the British came back and attacked us again. Okay, so that's like a very quick summary of the American Revolution. So let's talk about the revolution in the context of this course now, right? What about African Americans? Excuse me. So our first topic today is the man that I mentioned from the Boston Massacre, Crispus Attucks, the first black man to die for a U.S. cause. And if you take a look at video A, you can see a small biography about Attucks. This is also a portrait of Attucks, right? There's different depictions of him because he wasn't a wealthy man or a well-connected man before his death, so people had to sort of interpret him sometimes as they thought he was. So, tensions grew to a fever pitch during the Boston Massacre. At the time, Boston was not only an important shipping port for the colony of Massachusetts and its capital, but also a major center of resistance against British taxation. Their biggest issue with the British government came in 1768 with the enactment of the Townshend Acts, which enforced an import tariff on items that were made in England. So basically, if you wanted anything that came from the British, you had to pay an extra tax. They taxed things in that tax, by the way, like glass and lead and tea was one of them. In response, the Massachusetts House of Representatives tried to petition King George III to repeal it and also tried to recruit the other colonies to join their resistance. By that October, tensions escalated when four British regiments, meaning troops of soldiers, were sent to Boston in order to quell the resistance, although only two remained the following year. Propaganda fueled the anger of the colonists, particularly after the death of an 11-year-old boy, Christopher Sider, who was killed by a customs employee on February 22nd, 1770. So an 11-year-old kid was killed, and the Bostonians were pissed, right? So this sort of escalated things towards the massacre. Gangs of colonists began to form, looking for confrontation, as well as British soldiers who sought violence. On March 5th of that year, a young wig maker named Edward Garrick called out British Captain Lieutenant John Goldfinch for not paying what he owed to his master. Private Hugh White, a British soldier that was standing guard nearby, expressed that Garrick should have had more respect for Goldfinch. After Garrick started poking White in the chest during their argument, White hit Garrick on the side of his head with a musket. A larger crowd gathered at the scene, attracted by the fact that the church bells were ringing. Usually that was only for fires. Over 50 Bostonians gathered around White, led by mixed-race former slave Crispus Attucks. So, essentially, this is what happened. So there was a wig maker's apprentice. He approached a British soldier that had previously bought a wig from his master, and he confronted him and he said, "Hey, you haven't paid us back, what the hell?" And so they started arguing. Another British soldier came up and was like, "Hey, like, why are you arguing with him? You should respect us." And then other colonists came forward who were nearby and started harassing the British soldiers, right? And we'll talk about the escalation in a second. Crispus Attucks himself was born in Framingham, Massachusetts in 1723. An advertisement indicates that Attucks ran away in 1750 from his master, Deacon William Brown. If you take a look at video B, this is a portrayal of the Boston Massacre. So his master, when he ran away, offered 10 pounds for his return. This is another depiction of Attucks, by the way. He became a sailor and whaler, meaning he captured whales, right? Working on various docks along the Atlantic coast. Historians believe that Attucks went by the alias Michael Johnson in order to avoid recapture and was only in Boston temporarily at the time of the massacre. So he wasn't even from Boston. He was just there from a trip to the Bahamas and was set to take off to the Carolinas soon to do more work. So wrong place at the wrong time, essentially. Those who saw him believe that he was either mulatto or full-blooded Native American. We believe he was a mix of both. On the day of the Boston Massacre, Attucks led a group of men to Private White, all armed with clubs. The soldiers began shooting when one was reportedly hit by a club, some witnesses claiming that Attucks was the one to do it. So some accounts were that there were clubs. Other accounts, or the more accurate accounts, are that they threw snowballs and walnut shells, which were nearby, at the soldiers, and one of the soldiers freaked out and started shooting, and the other ones followed. And Attucks was the first one to die. Okay. But again, we don't have a clear picture because everybody was telling their own story. 5 colonists were killed, including Attucks, and 6 were wounded. Attucks was only 47 years old, and he took 2 ricocheted bullets to the chest. His body lay in wake until Thursday, March 8th, when he was buried with the others in a local gravesite. Now, this was interesting because former slaves, or black people in general, were segregated in cemeteries, meaning you couldn't be buried next to a white person, yet he was buried next to the 4 other white people who were killed during the Boston Massacre, which is very intriguing to me. The British soldiers who were accused of murder were defended by John Adams, our second president, who was a lawyer at the time. 2 of the soldiers were charged with manslaughter, but received brands on their thumbs rather than hanging, so the brand basically showed them as murderers. Adams called the crowd of colonists who taunted the soldiers a motley rabble of saucy boys, Negroes, and mulattoes, Irish Teagues, and outlandish Jactars. So basically called them a bunch of like hooligans. Furthermore, he accused Attucks of having undertaken to be the hero of the night and with having precipitated a conflict by his mad behavior. Again, there's no way that we can prove that Attucks was the one who led this. He could have just, participated in the rowdy crowd or been in the wrong place and not done anything and got killed, so we don't know. The event was named the Boston Massacre 2 years later by founding father Samuel Adams. As we know, things only escalated after that, leading to the founding fathers making their decision to finally leave England. So if you take a look at video C, this is a depiction, or this is a clip from an HBO show about John Adams, played by Paul Giamatti, who's very good. And this is a clip from the trial, where Adams successfully defended those British soldiers against the colonists, mainly by sort of tricking them into telling different stories, right? If you don't have the same story, then there's reasonable doubt to the crime, right? So he was a very good lawyer. And it's ironic, too, that Adams defended British soldiers when he would be part of the driving force to, get them out of the country a couple years later. This is a depiction of Crispus Attucks getting killed. Now, they make this into a more open plaza, but most likely it was in like a dark alleyway. But this looks like a more dramatic picture. And Attucks is hailed as the first Black Patriot, again, because he's the first Black man to die for American cause. And here is a picture without Attucks, but basically showing the devastation of the massacre, right? And sort of showing the colonists being the good guys and the British being the bad guys. So every year we celebrate the 4th of July, and that is specifically a celebration of our Declaration of Independence and our basically, I call it a breakup letter to England, right, saying we're not going to be part of it anymore. But here's the thing. The Declaration, which I mentioned before when we talked about Jefferson, they had to decide how they were going to handle slavery, right, because that was a huge part of the colony. And if you're going to write a letter or declaration asking for freedom, saying that the British basically enslaved us and every man is created equal, how are you going to have slaves, right? So that was the question. And here you can see a picture of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson wrote the Declaration, but he had John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, who are pictured sitting down at the table. He had them read over the draft, so this is a picture of that. So the Declaration was drafted by the Second Continental Congress at the Pennsylvania State House, now known as Independence Hall, which I visited, and you guys should because it's interesting, on July 4th, 1776. So the Declaration called for the secession of the American colonies from British rule, declaring their intention to create their own independent, democratic country. The United States of America is the name they came up with, right? However, not only was this document signed and drafted by slave owners, but it also ironically called for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. However, in the original draft, Jefferson did include a paragraph that admonished England for its involvement in the slave trade, but the paragraph was not present in the final draft. So this is something a lot of people don't know, right? And let's take a look at that real quick before we come back to this slide. So here's the last paragraph. This is what he said. So Jefferson said, he's referring to King George II, by the way. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye, he is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us, and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them, by murdering the people on whom he has obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. So basically what Jefferson is saying is it's King George III and England's fault that they have slavery in the first place. It's their fault that no anti-slavery measures have been passed in the United States, which there weren't a lot to proposed in the first place, right? And that the fact that England during the Revolutionary War, which we'll talk about, offered slaves freedom if they fought on the British side to kill U.S. patriots is ironic, right? That he's forcing slavery on them and yet having the slaves kill them. It's kind of bratty sounding to me. I don't know what you guys think, but it's just sort of like you can't place all the blame on England when you yourself have hundreds of slaves, you know. I'm glad he deleted it. That's why this shows you why you should edit your papers. Okay, let's get back to the information. Taking note of the contradiction between the Founding Fathers' revolutionary beliefs and their slaveholding lifestyles. So a British abolitionist said, "If there be an object truly ridiculous in nature, it is an American patriot, signing resolutions of independency with one hand, and with the other brandishing a whip over his affrighted slaves." So basically, one of the British abolitionists were like, you guys are full of shit, right? Some of the Founding Fathers, like Benjamin Franklin, went against their slaveholding colleagues. Franklin declared that slavery was an atrocious abasement of human nature and a source of serious evils. Franklin went on to establish the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery with Benjamin Rush in 1774. Additionally, John Adams called slavery a foul contagion in the human character and an evil of colossal magnitude. And James Madison, our fourth president, called it the most oppressive dominion ever exercised by man over man. Now, they're saying these things in a room full of men who mostly have slaves, right? Including Washington and Jefferson, who we said were some of the biggest planners in Virginia. Additionally, military men like Washington saw the cruel irony of having the slaves fight in the American Revolution, but continuing to deny their freedom afterwards. Before the Declaration was drafted, several of the northern states were already abolishing the purchase of slaves from the slave trade, like Rhode Island in 1774. By the time that the Constitution was drafted, all of the original colonies, except for Georgia, had banned or restricted the institution of slavery. So, banned or restricted, meaning they got rid of their slaves or they put certain measures. Now, of course, southern states like North and South Carolina, they're definitely going to still have slaves, right? All the states still had slaves for the most part, right, for the next couple decades. But some made moves to slowly emancipate their slaves, and we'll talk about that in the 6th PowerPoint. The first public debate about slavery in the Declaration did not take place until the Missouri Controversy of 1819 and 1821, in which Missouri became a slave state and Maine became a free state. Here's some of the stuff that I mentioned. This is the Declaration of Independence. If you want to see the Declaration in person, you can go to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Sorry, I dropped my pen. This building holds the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and sometimes they have the Emancipation Proclamation. So you can see those documents in person. Okay, and we'll talk about the Missouri controversy later on. So congressmen who were anti-slavery argue that the language of the Declaration of Independence indicated that the founding fathers were against slavery, and thus slavery should not extend to new states. On the other side, pro-slavery congressmen argued that the Declaration was not a part of the Constitution and thus was not relevant to the debate. So the Declaration was our statement of intent. It's not a law at all. The Constitution is. And we'll talk about how slavery was written specifically in this Constitution. So the pro-slavery side has a valid argument, right? Legally, slavery was in the Constitution, but the Declaration was not a legal document. It's not our law, basically. It's just a statement. Those who defended slavery, like Vice President John C. Calhoun, who was vice president from 1825 to 1832, argued that the phrase, all men are created equal, did not apply to black people. So he blatantly said that. He's like, they didn't think about black people. What are you talking about? So if you take a look at video D, this is a speech that I try to post every year or think about. And more recently, a lot of people have been posting this speech due to the Black Lives Matter movement. So Frederick Douglass, who we'll talk about later, he was a former black slave and abolitionist, and also Abraham Lincoln's advisor on black issues. He coined a speech later on about how the 4th of July doesn't apply to black people because of slavery and everything. So take a look at, this is an actor who's reciting the speech. It's very good. Okay, so the last two topics of the day have to do with British Loyalists. Okay, so first of all, in general, in the American Revolution, people were split 3 ways, okay? A third of Americans supported the revolution, okay, only 1/3. 1/3 of them supported the British. They believed, why are we getting away from England? We have solid support. England's powerful. What are you doing? Then the last third were neutral. They didn't want to be on the Patriot side. They didn't want to be on the British side, right? They didn't even want a war. So people were pretty split. Everybody acts like the U.S. was all on board, and that's definitely not true. For black slaves, they had to kind of pick a side in some cases, right? Are you going to go with the Americans or are you going to go with the British? So we'll talk about now the Black Loyalists, or the black people who decided that the British were a better side. And you can make the decision for yourself whichever side, if you were a slave, you would go for. So the Black Loyalists joined the British because partly the British have had a history of in their own country not having slavery, right? Even though they had slavery in the colonies and other places, they didn't have it in England, right? In 1772, slavery was outlawed in England within its borders. A number of American slaves believed that King George III was on their side, and some began to run towards their freedom in England. While tensions rose leading up to the American Revolution, colonists began to fear an English-led slave rebellion, which the British began to see as an advantage. In 1775, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, issued his own proclamation calling for all able-bodied men, including slaves, to join them against the Patriots. This is what his proclamation promised, okay, and here it is. I do require every person capable of bearing arms to resort to His Majesty's standard or be looked upon as traitors to His Majesty's crown and government, and thereby become liable to the penalty the law inflicts upon such offenses, such as forfeiture of life, confiscation of lands, etc., etc. And I do hereby further declare all indentured servants, Negroes or others, referring to the rebels, free that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as may be, for the more speedily reducing this colony to a proper sense of their duty to His Majesty's crown and dignity. Okay, so why are we talking about that proclamation? Well, it enticed the slaves to join by offering their freedom, right? If you fight with us, you're automatically free. Within the next month, over 800 slaves had fled to Norfolk, Virginia, ready to enlist in the British Army. In retaliation, Virginia slave owners promised to execute any slave that ran away, also telling their slaves that the British proclamation was a lie and that they actually intended to sell them to sugar plantations in the West Indies. So the Virginians basically lied to them and said, oh, like, this isn't true, like, you gotta stay here, blah, 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 right? Lord Dunmore's proclamation is considered to be the first mass emancipation of slaves in America, right? Ironic that the British were the first to emancipate a bunch of slaves before we did. And this picture is of one of those slaves, or I guess now free blacks, wearing a British uniform. The Declaration of Independence referenced this proclamation by saying King George III had excited domestic insurrections among us. After the start of the American Revolution, British generals implored the Loyalists to emancipate their slaves so that they could boost the British Army's numbers. So basically, the British asked their followers, like, hey, free your slaves so that we could win, we'll get way more troops, and this will be over soon. Sort of make sacrifices for the war effort. Okay. Here is another troop fighting on the British side, although he's not wearing a red coat, right? However, when the British Army acquired 30,000 Hessian, aka German, right, because Germany didn't become Germany until the late 1800s, mercenary troops, they no longer had much of a need for former slaves, right? They hired their own troops, so they didn't need all these untrained former slaves. Sir William Howe, Commander-in-Chief of the British forces, banned the formation of new black regiments and disbanded his own. However, it was still advantageous for the British to continue to free slaves, as it benefited them both economically and strategically, right? If you free all these black slaves, you can hire them to do stuff, you can send them to England, well, to do the low-paying jobs, or other places, and you also take away the economic power of the colonists, right? If you're taking away their slaves, which were the backbone of the economy. However, Loyalists often returned escaped slaves to their British masters, although they asked that the slaves not be punished. So they did free some slaves, but they also returned other slaves, right? So it's interesting. In 1778, the Patriots began to promise freedom to the escaped slaves of the Loyalists. However, no matter which side they escaped to, many of the slaves were sold back into slavery. After the British eventually lost the war, they did take thousands of freed slaves with them, so they did keep their promise to thousands of Black Loyalists. These Black Loyalists were resettled in the Caribbean colonies, like Jamaica. They also were taken to Canada and London. However, Canada's climate was hard for freed slaves to adjust because it's so cold, and the poor blacks of London had difficulty finding work. So they promised to free you, but they didn't promise you a better life. If you take a look at video E, this is a video showing some information about the Canadian Loyalists and some of their descendants. Ultimately, the British formed Freetown, a new settlement in Sierra Leone, where over 2,000 Black Loyalists from London, Canada, and Jamaica resettled. So Freetown was one of the first major black settlements in Africa. I think I mentioned it before. Here is Freetown today. Very beautiful. So we talked about kind of what happened to them and why they joined, right? The Black Loyalists. So we're going to end today by discussing what their regiments look like, right? What did they do during the war? Because that's important too. Okay. So there were many black regiments during the American Revolution. The largest regiment was the Black Company of Pioneers, or the Black Pioneers, who were responsible for building roads, digging trenches, and other manual labor. They were typically divided into smaller corps and attached to larger armies. They would support General Clinton's regiments in North Carolina, New York, Newport, Rhode Island, and Philadelphia. This regiment was never put in combat, thus receiving no casualties. They were also ordered to attend the scavengers, assist in cleaning the streets, and removing all nuisances being thrown into the streets, meaning they were on cleanup duty. Throughout Black history in this country, most of the time Black soldiers were recruited specifically to do the grunt work, right? Cooking, cleaning, digging latrines, aka where you use the toilet, things like that, right? Lord Dunmore had his own regiment of over 800 freed slaves called the Ethiopian Regiment, although they had nothing to do with Ethiopia. These were the 800 soldiers or freed slaves who ran away within the month of the proclamation, which we just mentioned, right? They were briefly trained before their first battle, the Battle of Kemp's Landing in Virginia, where they achieved a victory over the Patriots. After they were overwhelmed at the Battle of Great Bridge, Dunmore loaded the Ethiopian regiment onto British ships, hoping to take the time to train them better. However, the cramped conditions of the ship led to the spread of smallpox, okay, with only 300 of the original black soldiers surviving. So over about 500 or maybe less than that died just on the ship, not even fighting, which sucks, right? And here's a picture of one of those regiments. Okay, here's some more Black Loyalists, right? A modern depiction of them. Finally, the Black Brigade was a small combat unit of only 24 soldiers in New Jersey. They were led by Colonel Ty, an escaped slave from Monmouth County, New Jersey. However, the title was unofficial as blacks could not be formally commissioned as officers, meaning that you could never become a general or a colonel or anything like that, right? And what sucked about that is if you don't get that promotion, you don't get the money. This actually would continue until after World War II. Like, black people still weren't able to get higher positions in the military. If you take a look at video F, the last video, there's some information about Colonel Ty and who he was. They were the most feared loyalists in New Jersey. Unfortunately, Colonel Ty died after a raid on the Patriots in 1780, contracting gangrene from a cut in his wrist. Gangrene is a very nasty infection. When the war was over, many white loyalists wanted black soldiers to be returned to them so that they could increase the reparations that they would receive from damaged property. So the black loyalists who were loyal to the British had their plantations and stuff damaged during the Revolution, so they wanted their slaves back to maybe sell or work to make back that money. However, as I mentioned, the British intended to keep their promise to relocate the black loyalists elsewhere. However, as the British evacuated, American slave owners attempted to recapture their former slaves. They would snatch up anyone who was black, including those who were born free, and sold them back into slavery. As per the Treaty of Paris in 1783, Congress ordered General Washington to retrieve any American property from the British, including slaves. In order to evacuate the black loyalists, the British promised that for every black loyalist that could prove their service, they would get certificates of freedom and their former owners would be compensated. Right. So General Washington said that because the Americans won, right, that they could take whatever the British had. That included the slaves. So many of the former slaves were snatched up as they were trying to escape, which sucked. Right? The Certificate of Freedom is basically a document that shows, like, as I mentioned before, such and such is free on this date by this person, and they sign it, right? And compensating the master, which happened quite a bit, and we'll talk about that too more in PowerPoint 6, sort of paying them for the slave that they're giving up because they invested money into that slave, and that's a financial loss for them. So many of the Black Loyalists were recorded in General Carleton's Book of Negroes, which contained their names and descriptions. So that's a primary source that we have showing who these former slaves were. Over 3,000 former slaves were recorded in that book, although there are two versions of the book, the American version and the British version. Many descendants of the Black Loyalists have used the book in order to trace their ancestry. So even though they had certificates of freedom, even though they fought on the British side, many were still recaptured. But many made it to Freetown in Canada and London, so there are descendants of those brave former slaves who decided to take up arms and to fight against their former masters, right? And the same thing would happen in the Civil War as well. Here is a page from that book that I just mentioned, right? They basically wrote your name and your age and maybe something about you, or right? They say like a fine girl, a something fellow, right? Things like that, sort of like a description of what you're like. And this is a Black Loyalist family. Probably ran away to Canada or something. So that's the end of today's lecture. Next time we are going to continue the American Revolution by talking about the Black Patriots, right? The Black people who joined the American side, probably hoping that the Americans would free them. We will also talk about a Black Patriot that sort of had an unusual way of participating in this war. We will also talk about what happened immediately after the war, and also the first published Black female poet in this country. It was a slave at the time when she wrote her first poetry book.